My friends, we've been tinkering with this model for some time now, It's been only, several weeks, and we've been dealing with stuff like oils, chipping, and rust effects, and some other stuff. But now it's time to put all of that under a nice thick layer of dust and mud. So goodbye Green Tiger, it's been nice knowing you. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, my name is Uncle Nightshift and the end of this project is getting closer and closer, but we're not entirely there yet. I think we have only 2 more episodes left after this one, and tonight is gonna be about all the nature effects, aka dust, dry mud and wet mud. So the first step, as usual in my case, is to apply some acrylic textured earth from Wilder. The color doesn't really matter too much because I'm gonna repaint it in a moment, but I usually like to use this light gray tone because it's easier to cover it with paint. I always find it best and easiest and safest to start on the wheels, especially on those which will be pretty much completely out of sight. This way I can get a better grasp on the technique because yeah, even though I do this pretty much on every model, the long periods between each time I do it can make me forget a few things. I don't know if that makes any sense. I hope it does. Anyway, so yeah, that's the way I like to start. And here we can appreciate how much easier the process is when the wheels are glued together. But as you can see, the outermost wheels are kept separate. That's simply because those will be the most visible, and this way I can also access those right behind them, which are not gonna be entirely hidden either, so it's good to have this type of control over the effect. And also, note how I'm adding more mud on those at the back and very little on those at the front. It's a simple thing, most of the mud would fall off the tracks at the back of the tank. And it's also nice to have at least some of the previous paint job showing through. And I almost forgot, this textured earth is an acrylic product, so I'm blending it with tap water. That's one of the reasons I like it so much. The lower hull is pretty much the same story. Most of it won't be visible anyway, so I'm not trying to be very precise. My goal is to just add some texture. One thing that's very important here is that we have to make sure we'll be able to assemble the running gear afterwards. So what this means, don't apply extremely thick layers of mud because all of a sudden you might find yourself in a pretty unpleasant situation where you can't fit the wheels back. So to be completely safe and save some time, I didn't add any mud on the torsion bar swing arms because they'll be completely hidden behind the wheels anyway. And as I moved towards the front, I tried to create at least something that might look interesting, because here we'll have a huge gap, so a lot of it will be visible under certain angles if the lighting conditions are right. The back plate offers a very unique situation because one fender is missing. So I started adding controlled amounts of mud around the left side first, because this is the only place where mud would collect here. And by the way, it's useful to have the model photographed in its assembled state. So this way I can always check where the tracks will be and how would they distribute the mud around the tank. The right side is gonna be pretty intense, and this is something I always wanted to do. Like, if there was ever a chance for me to build a tiger, I had to make it with at least one fender missing so I could splatter it with mud. And since the tiger had very wide tracks, a lot of mud would be thrown on the side plates, especially if the side skirts are missing. But here it's important to realize that the mud would fly up only around the idler wheel, because that's where the tracks move up. For the rest of the tank, the track moves forward, so the mud should be only accumulated here. You can trust me, I checked it with a few historical photos, which basically makes me an expert. And I also smeared some on the bottom of the hull. I mostly ignore this part on my models, but because I sometimes use a mirror turntable, you know, I add at least some on the very back and the very front portion. So yeah, alright, so now we have the basic textures laid down and the model surprisingly doesn't look that horrible. But it still looks horrible, and that's where the next step comes into play, and that next step is pre-dusting with an airbrush. This model has two colors, gray and green, which work with different dust tones. Gray works with more saturated dust, while the green is the exact opposite. So I tried mixing something in between, and the result was this paint. It also contains about 75% lacquer thinner. I again started on the wheels because they are just a good starting point for me. I focused the pre-dusting only on those places covered with textured mud. First, to give it a color that I'm more happy with. Second, to smooth out the jagged transition between the mud and the clean surface. And third, to make sure the upcoming weathering effects don't get sucked in by the mud. I'd like to talk about that a little bit more as I keep pre-dusting the remaining muddy sections. So, this is a problem you'll notice rather quickly if you try to work with acrylic textured mud from any brand. It's a porous. Did I say that right? Porous? Porous? That it has pores? Yeah, so it is porous material, which naturally absorbs all fluids, like a sponge. And what this means is that if you try to paint it over with, let's say, enamel dust or dry mud, or whatever, and then blend it, you'd end up removing everything from those clean sections, and the paint would only remain absorbed in the textured mud. So, one of the points of pre-dusting is to lay down the smooth transition between the mud and the clean parts. Even if the brush applied dust gets absorbed by the textured earth, there will be the pre-dusted layer, so the result will be still very good. But it's not only about airbrushing over the textured mud. I like to use pre-dusting on the upper surfaces as well, mainly in those places where I want to have heavy dust accumulations. Again, this makes the weathering process faster, but it also makes the upcoming step easier. However, it's important to be careful and not get carried away, because the airbrush can quickly get out of hand, and before you know it, you'll have most of your precious work hidden under a thick, opaque layer of dust forever. Never to be seen again unless you go back and watch the previous videos. The final result of the pre-dusting stage is rather subtle, but you can already notice how the weathering is slowly starting to take shape. It's also toning down the striking contrast between the different colored parts of the model, which is something this tank needed from the moment I painted it. I just feel like I shouldn't go as heavy on the back because I could have always added more with the upcoming techniques, but whatever. Anyway, next up is my favorite dry earth acrylic paint from Wilder. What makes it unique is that it can be reactivated and blended at any moment with water, but it doesn't react with enamels. Because the wheels are already pretty dusty and muddy, I'm applying it as a sort of earth-colored wash. I'm not very concerned with what I said a moment ago about the textured mud absorbing most of the paint, because truth be told, it's good to still have at least a small bit of the previous paint layer still visible. At least until I hit it with a darker mud tone in a second. I also applied it on the sides in form of rain marks, or in less technical speech, vertical streaks of dust. And this is when I start breaking the smooth airbrush layers of dust with more random and natural looking effects. Even though, if I'm being honest, blending such effects over the Zimmerit is not the easiest thing. I'd say it's almost impossible, at least for me anyway. But on the horizontal surfaces, well, that's a completely different story. This is where the random mottled effects are gonna be most visible, but at the same time, it's again important to keep them at bay so we won't cover up the previous layers. Especially those 70+ hours worth of chipping. And this is also a great opportunity to create more contrast between some details. That's the reason why I'm keeping the Commander's cupola separate the entire time. Not only because it's painted in different colors, but also so I can easily airbrush and blend dust colors around it. So most of the weathering so far has been rather subtle, but we can easily tell it's there. I guess we should now switch to enamel paints and create some more gnarly effects. The first will be dry earth from ammo, which I had to mix with about 10% of earth, terrible name for a paint, and it was because the dry earth was too vivid, and I had to match it with what I already had on the model. And because this paint is quite dense, it's excellent for speckling. This method is great when I need to create more texture transitions between different paints or effects. And if I add too much, the paint is easily removed with enamel thinner. But there's still no chance to make it noticeable on the Zimmerit, so let's hope the last layer will do the trick. And that one will be a dark mud tone. Once again, I started on the wheels, and just like I did on the previous model, I focused most of the effect towards the rear of the assembly, where fresh mud would fall down from the tracks. And a lot less on those towards the front. One tricky thing about these steel Tiger road wheels is that their shape is basically telling us to apply the mud as a wash into all crevices and around details, but that would look very unnatural, so it's important to keep the effect random in terms of shape and amount as well. And of course some muddy speckling can help us take it even further. Then there's the lower hull, and again I didn't pay too much attention here because most of it won't be ever seen again except this corner, which seemed to me like a perfect place to create lots of random streaking effects which will be visible even on the finished model, at least some of them. And just like on the road wheels, a little bit of speckling finished the job. Not sure how much of that will be visible, but it only takes a few seconds, so why not? Here it's important to not get carried away and again keep in mind how the tracks are moving. As such, I started by adding a small amount of mud at the bottom, followed up by some blending, and then of course speckling. A lot of speckling. I always wanted to make this effect on a tiger, I always wanted to make a muddy tiger, especially at the back. I don't know why, but I guess it's because of the massive tracks that protrude from the hull, and also the plain brick-like shape of the hull, and of course the Zimmerit. I was always curious how it feels to weather this surface. Well, now I know. It's not fun. But I'm starting to repeat myself on several levels. So I also used the mud tone to add even more contrast on the upper surfaces. Here I decided to go a bit heavy because I wanted to have this sort of muddy shadow. I know, sounds weird, but that's the best way I can describe it. So yeah, muddy shadow around the turret, but then to make it suddenly stop. So the top plate would be distinguished from the engine deck. I will enhance this effect even further with water effects later, aka in the final video. So, okay. Now we have most of the weathering effects in place. Next week will be about weathering the tracks, and I want to put them on right after they're painted, so before I even touch them, there's one more thing I need to take care of. This tiger has lots of wheels. Yeah, thanks Captain Obvious. And all of them are metal with no rubber cladding. So they need to be nice and shiny, because that's kind of a thing, you know. Wheels getting polished by coming into contact with the tracks. So I had to sand these contact points to remove any unwanted texture and paint buildup. And then I grabbed a bottle of silver Tamiya paint. Because we don't need any special metallic paints for this effect. And I carefully brushed it on those worn sections of every wheel. The idler is gonna be pretty shiny because the guiding teeth on the tracks go right along the side. I think that'll be pretty cool once the tracks are in place. And the last step is to polish them. I've been using graphite powder before, but now that I have this black metallic pigment from VMS, I don't need to grind pencils against sandpaper anymore. Funny thing is that I used the same pigment last week to create smoke residue on the exhausts. And I didn't notice it was metallic, because it'll remain black until you polish it. And for that I'm using this weird looking black thing, which is a rubber sculpting brush. And it's an excellent applicator and polisher. Is that a word? But anyway, there's something strangely appealing about this effect, don't you think? I mean... Anyway, my friends, that will have to do for tonight. To be completely honest with every one of you, I feel like the weathering is still missing something. And I'm not talking about the final effects like grease, water and so on, but rather the dust and mud tones. I think the model could use a few more of them, both dry and wet. But the problem is, I don't know where. I need to finish the tracks first, then put them on, and then I'll have a much better idea. In fact, I used to weather the lower hull including the tracks first, and then I moved on to the upper hull and the turret. But I guess that was a long time ago, or maybe I should start doing it again. Anyway, thank you for getting all the way to the end of the video, and if you enjoyed it, let me know by giving it a like and leaving a comment. Also a huge thank you to my generous patrons who make this weekly show possible, because surprise surprise, it's a lot of work to make these videos. And you know, to give at least something in return, I'm also giving a lot of rewards and updates over there on that Patreon page that I'm talking about right now. Like almost daily updates from my workbench, 1 week early ad-free videos, and we can also communicate through DMs all the time. Also, I suppose the tiger is already finished as we speak right now at this moment, so yeah, I think it's worth checking it out, because patrons already know how it looks and maybe also what's coming next. And the best thing is, it all starts at just $1 a month, which is a total bargain if you ask me. Anyway, that's all I wanted to say, so thanks again everyone, I hope you'll have a great day, evening or morning, and I wish you an amazing weekend. Stay safe and keep building models. This is Uncle Night Shift signing off.